its utopian vision of the future, Star Trek has had a history of making its central characters, the Starfleet and Federation ones at least, arguably far too perfect to require redemption. Save from the most minuscule of vices. The Mary Sue doesn't suffer from temptation after all. Whilst Kirk and crew were mostly the brazen heroic type, an all-round squeaky cleanness seemed to be particularly common by the time we got our first glimpses at the 24th century. Gene Roddenberry's original 1964 Star Trek Is pitch clearly stated that, quote, the characters should be fully identifiable as people like us. Later, the 1987 Star Trek The Next Generation Writer's Director's Guide went on to point out that those on the Enterprise D, quote, have human faults and weaknesses too, but that they have been selected for this mission because of their ability to transcend their human failings. No one was ever meant to be flawless, merely aspirational. Things have also changed over the years, and we've now had a fair few questionables who've made good through their service in Starfleet. It is true that the majority of seriously irredeemable baddies have tended to come from the outside in, but plenty of non-Starfleet, non-Federation members have found their own road to betterment too. Here we will be using redemption primarily in the sense of the act of redeeming, i.e. compensate for the faults or bad aspects of, or do something that compensates for poor past performance or behaviour, or atone or make amends for. We'll let the prophets and Par Wraith sort out the sin and salvation part. Finally, there will be no redemption parts 1 or 2 on this list, as that is a little too blatant, even for the blunter-than-a-used Batleth Klingons. So with that in mind, I'm Ellie for TrekCulture, and here are the 10 greatest redemption stories in Star Trek. Number 10. Rotten to Revolutionary, Damar. The tide of history turned on a wave of ships. Had the prophets not intervened on that day to send the Dominion Armada to only the gods know where, it's unlikely we'd be talking about redemption for Damar at all. He would have undoubtedly gone on to preside over the wreckage of the Alpha Quadrant, albeit still as Dukat's underling. Damar hardly deserves a round of applause then for finally realizing he had always been on the losing side, especially since that realization came only after he had personally lost out. Seeing the light is a poor substitute for having done the right thing in the first place. And let's not forget he also killed Zial in the interim. Nevertheless, for a Cardassian, his tardy epiphany was nothing short of a 180 on full thrusters. Back on Cardassia after the descent of Dukat, things went from crap to catastrophic for Damar. He became full-time patsy for the Dominion, the voiceless frontman for his people whose subjugation had already been signed on the dotted line. Damar's moment of redemption and the redemption of all Cardassia came, although at a terrible cost, when he chose to rebel against his Dominion puppeteers. Even in the face of brutal retaliation, Damar resisted on. He eventually gave his life for the cause, but his cries of "For Cardassia" have already been heard far and wide, and the Cardassians began to turn against their Dominion masters. In life, Damar might have begun as the wannabe despot, but in death, he had helped liberate his people and ensure the freedom of the entire Alpha Quadrant. Number 9. Murder to Mindfulness, Lon Suda. We don't know a lot about Lon Suda. We know even less about Frank Darwin, other than the fact that his side career as a hand model was well and truly over by the beginning of Meld. Killed by coil spanner and shoved into an EPS conduit, crewman Darwin's journey home ended on the night shift in engineering. Not much of a whodunit in this case, it was Suda, the murderer, of course. A Betazoid tormented by his violent tendencies, Suda had joined the Marquis as a way of letting off some of that homicidal steam, but aboard Voyager he had no such release valve mechanism. When the red mist descended, Suda succumbed to his baser instincts. He killed Darwin pretty much because he didn't like the way the guy looked at him. That or he really had something against the theory of evolution. Tuvok, in all his Vulcanness, couldn't accept the apparent illogic of murder without motive, and so melded with Suda to get some answers. That turned out to be a far better experience for Suda than it was for Tuvok. After Tuvok had calmed down a bit, the pair continued to work together. Suda, arrested in his quarters, made strides towards a more mindful existence, free of violence. Later, without Suda's help and self-sacrifice, Voyager would most likely never have been retaken from the Kazon. If Darwin's murder was a visceral expression of the rift between the Marquis and Starfleet crews, Suda's redemptory death was the catharsis. Out of the worst of themselves, the two crews had shown the best of themselves. They could now move forward together. Number 8. Hollow to hello, Reginald Barclay. Redemption is by necessity a vicarious experience, and absolution often says more about the person offering it than the one receiving it. Before redemption, there is always the imperative to seek it out. Like a relapse of any addiction or the worsening of a phobia or anxiety, Barclay was a character who typically hit the reset button each time we saw him, facing the same uphill battle for vindication in spite of his personal difficulties. Within the hierarchical power structures of an organization like Starfleet, pardon in an official sense can normally only be handed down the ranks, but Lieutenant Barclay, in all his genius and dogged determination, flipped the narrative on these power dynamics. If Barclay had to be proven right, it was only because those around him had to find forgiveness for thinking he was wrong. Two scenes from the Star Trek Voyager episode Pathfinder in particular illustrate the changing power at play. In the first, at around 15 minutes, the camera, as per Admiral Paris and Commander Hawkins, looks down on Barclay as he struggles to find the words to explain his idea for contacting Voyager. Aboard the Enterprise D, Barclay had suffered with hollow addiction, transportophobia, social anxiety, and hypochondria. Here in Pathfinder, his hollow addiction had seemingly resurfaced, as had his social anxiety when addressing Admiral Paris and the crowd assembled. Far from understanding, Hawkins simply dismisses Barclay from above. Later, after Barclay has made his attempt to contact Voyager and Voyager has replied, he, Paris, and Hawkins are lined up on the same plane at a console with the camera tilted slightly up at all three. This newfound visual equality matches Barclay's newfound professional equality. "I'm sorry I doubted you," Dawkins says, but the apology's a little late. Redemption's not for Barclay, it's for other people. Number 7. Nitwit to Nagus, Rom. They say it's better to remain silent and be thoughtful than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt. Rom certainly never took a page out of the Morn Handbook for Scintillating Conversation, but neither was he the idiot everyone thought he was. Very much portrayed as the station's nitwit at first, Rom was also decidedly a lot more sinister when we first met him, and much more like your traditional Ferengi, willing to airlock his own brother if it meant getting his hands on the bar. Rule of acquisition number 6, never allow family to stand in the way of opportunity. There was also that time he embezzled money from charity. He did let Nog go to school though, most distressing. Unsurprised reversal, Rom was, in fact, a genius, particularly in the field of engineering. His prodigious technical solutions helped save crew and quadrant on several occasions. Rom never truly lost the lobes for business either, but he did become a kinder, more open-minded, less greedy Ferengi. In that, he was a perfect fit for the next Nagus. Rom's radical redemption, alongside the evolution of brother Quark and son Nog, was then, by extension, that of all Ferengi. When introduced in Star Trek The Next Generation's first season, the Ferengi were more 50 Shades than convincing foe. In Star Trek Deep Space Nine, they were quite simply the Magnificent. Number 6. Florida to Venezuela, Degra. Leaving the deepest, deadliest of canals from Florida to Venezuela with plans to come back and go full Hitchhiker's Guide is a tough place to start a journey of redemption. As the project lead on the Xindi weapon, Degra was directly responsible for the deaths of 7 million people on Earth, and that was just his prototype. After Captain Archer's quantum-dated intervention, however, Degra not only sought out atonement, he essentially switched sides. We've previously called the Sphere Builders irredeemable of their villainy because, well, playground rules, they started it, and as if not more importantly, they never gave up trying to kill all humans. It was also the Sphere Builders who manipulated Degra and fellow Xindi into thinking that humanity was an existential threat. The Xindi pulled the trigger, but no Sphere Builders, no need for the giant space gun in the first place. Naturally, the murder of 7 million can never be pardoned, but Degra did at least ask for some semblance of forgiveness once he'd learned the truth. More than that, he did everything in his power to prevent the use of the full-scale weapon, to ensure that there was no more human blood on his hands. In fact, Degra changed so much as a character that by the time he was on the unfortunate end of Dolan's blade in the Council, it was impossible not to feel sorry for him. In the end, Degra's risk and self-sacrifice helped save countless worlds, humanity, and the Xindi too. Number 5. Fights to Fighter, Balana Torres. Balana Torres never really needed to seek out redemption. Others often saw in her what she was unable to see in herself. Balana's story was one of self-acceptance, self-absolution for her own perceived failings, and the rebuilding of bridges and barges with her parents. As a child, Balana was bullied because of her half-Klingon heritage, reacting with aggression, although not without a certain degree of engineering talent even then. Still a young child, Balana also had to face abandonment by her father, John Torres, for which she blamed herself and her Klingon side. Things didn't get much better during Balana's brief stint at the academy, where she threw a few punches in the lab and eventually quit of her own accord, much to the disappointment of many of her professors. Balana barely had the time to get settled in the Marquis before being flung halfway across the galaxy. There, however, she found a space and a home for herself where she had struggled to find anywhere else, even in the Marquis. Aboard Voyager, Balana went from breaking noses to fixing the warp core, from angry child to chief engineer with a loving family. Her daughter Morale might have been the literal savior for some, but Balana, with help from those around her, had fought to save herself. Number 4. Catsuit to Command, 7 of 9. 7 of 9 was always far, far more than the skin-tight dermoplastic garments the Doctor designed for her. But there is little denying that the character was introduced in the middle of Voyager's road home as a way to boost ratings through sex appeal. Thankfully, 7 was allowed a significant amount of growth in the years aboard ship that followed, going from foe to friend and trusted colleague, although the less said about the dalliance with Chakotay, the better. In the eyes of many, as a former Borg drone, 7 had to atone for her actions within the collective. It was soon made clear, however, that 7 was a survivor, like all Borg, an unwilling servant. Assimilated as a young child, 7 had known little else but the collective until Voyager came along. At first angry and resentful at being pulled away from the Borg, 7 clashed with Captain Janeway at every opportunity, and rejected humanity at every turn. Before Voyager made it home, 7 had become a beloved member of the crew, both on and off screen. Even Balana had to admit to that. Her return in Star Trek Picard was also a resounding triumph, and there were no more catsuits! However, while 7 had been embraced on Voyager, she was bizarrely rejected by Starfleet because of her former Borg status. After several years, Starfleet finally redeemed itself by allowing 7 to serve as commander on the Titan A and then captain of the Enterprise G. 7 forged one for herself, but she still deserves a, legacy? Wink wink, nudge nudge. Number 3, Court Martial to Captain Michael Burnham. Today's lesson. If you're planning on launching a first strike against the Klingons and need to nerve pinch your captain to do so, make sure they're properly unconscious before you leave the room. Michael Burnham's mutiny didn't exactly get very far, as Georgiou was quickly back on her feet and back on the bridge. Proper preparation prevents piss-poor photon torpedo launches, people. Or perhaps Burnham's Vulcan side wasn't quite as practiced after all. Burnham's life was particularly difficult from the start. At only 10 years old, both her parents, or so we thought, were killed while she was hiding in the same room. Then, to add insult to Klingon injury, Burnham had to grow up on Vulcan, which wasn't exactly a safe haven for humans at that point in its history. Logic extremists were trying to blow up anything that didn't fit within their strictest of definitions, and the Vulcans more generally were still pretty prejudiced about who they let into their expeditionary group. Zarek lied to Burnham about that, and then Spock joined Starfleet anyway. If you'd gone through the same, you'd probably nerve pinch your captain at the first opportunity too. At her court-martial, Burnham pleaded guilty on all charges, was stripped of rank and sentenced to imprisonment for life. She was then plucked out of prison by Captain Lorca, but it turned out he was the evil version who just needed her as part of his plan to return to the Mirror Universe. Burnham went on to help end the Klingon War, and after that, to save the entire galaxy from control. No time to rest, her redemption story traversed the centuries, leaving most of her family behind in the 23rd to move to the 32nd. There, she was demoted, then promoted to captain of the Discovery A, and saved the galaxy again, twice. That's quite enough redeeming for anyone.
Actually, that's 3 times now, and she's an admiral, and she's a son for a captain, with whom we've got an interview coming up on the channel, so keep an eye out for that one. Okay, back to Ellie.
Number 2. Bad to Dad, Tom Paris. Tom Paris. Now, where have I seen that face before? We don't talk about Locarno. No. Do we? They may have looked identical, whether Boimler could see it or not, but unlike his doppelganger, Paris grew out of his bad boy phase. For Locarno, being bad wasn't a phase at all. Tom Paris never wanted to join Starfleet. He saw a career for himself in the Federation Naval Patrol, ships on the actual sea, not ships in the sea of space. However, when your dad's already top Starfleet brass and gives a yearly holiday sermon on the Prime Directive, probably instead of presents, you've really got little choice but to put down the Jules Verne and pick up the Starship Operations Manual. I believe they call that doing a reverse Malcolm Reed. Paris just about scraped through Starfleet Academy, but his first posting on the USS Exeter was a disaster. Much like his lookalike, Paris covered up piloting error, on his part in this case, that caused the deaths of 3 other officers. He was drummed out of Starfleet and joined the Marquis, although not for long. After only a few weeks, Paris was arrested for treason and sent to a penal colony in New Zealand. Captain Janeway took a punt on Paris, although not planning that her boat would sail all the way to the Delta Quadrant. There, Paris flourished, with just the odd hiccup along the way, one involving his love of the ocean and that fake out to flush out a certain Michael Jonas. On Voyager, Paris made friends, a career, and a family, and his dad was mighty proud of him too. Number 1, Zero to Hero, Sito Jaxa. Speaking of not speaking of Nick Locarno, before he became a better planet, he was making for a shoddy human being and an even lousier Starfleet Academy cadet. Out for glory rather than just good grades, Locarno gathered a band of followers under his Nova Squadron wing, one of whom was then Cadet Sito Jaxa. The team's practice run of the banned Culvered Starburst maneuver ended in tragedy, the death of fellow squad member Joshua Albert. Locarno's influence notwithstanding, none of Nova Squadron lacked their own agency. Sito, like the rest of the team, chose to attempt the maneuver in the first place and then to sit there and cover up the truth about the accident. Locarno was out for his own ego, but the others weren't above flattering and protecting theirs either. Had it not been for Wesley's change of testimony after the hearing had ended, with Picard's first duty speech kicking in at the last minute, Sito and all would have walked away with little more than a formal reprimand. As it was, they were nearly expelled, but in the end, they just had to repeat the year. To Sito's credit, she gathered her strength and moved forward with courage, going on to graduate before her first-year friend Beckett Mariner. At Captain Picard's request, Sito then made it on board the Enterprise D. "I wanted to make sure you got a fair chance to redeem yourself," he told her after a test of a dressing down. And we're all still in tears about what happened to Sito next, with Picard saying over the comm, "She was the finest example of a Starfleet officer and a young woman of remarkable courage." Later, Mariner, through Sito, would find her own form of redemption, realizing that in death, her good friend would want her to live. And that concludes our list. If you think we missed a glaringly obvious one, then do let us know in the comments down below. While you're there, don't forget to hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification bell. Also, head over to the various social media pages and follow us there as well. In the meantime, I've been Ellie for TrekCulture. I hope you have a wonderful day, and remember to boldly go where no one has gone before.